Hello, everybody. My name is Luis. I am a PhD student at TU Delft, and I work under the supervision of Dr. Ye Huang, also at TU Delft, and Professor John Provis in the University of Sheffield. And the topic of my conversation today is on the evaluation of the effect of calcium on the reactivity of alkali-activated systems. To talk about that, let's just briefly summarize the reaction process of alkali-activated materials. So first, we have the amorphous portion of the precursors, which will make contact with alkaline solutions. These alkaline solutions have high pH, which will destroy the framework of the precursor and will release reactive ions to the aqueous medium. These reactive ions will combine with each other to form what we know as reaction products, like the gels, the primary reaction products, or some secondary reaction products. So essentially, everything begins with the dissolution of the glass portion of the precursor. And the dissolution of glasses actually has three main stages. So initially, we have a very high dissolution rate, which takes place in the forward stage. So it's the immediate contact of the precursor with the alkaline solutions, which releases reactive cations in very fast rates. Later on, these reactive species that were initially released will combine with each other to start forming some activated complex materials. And this will create sort of a passivating layer in the surface of the particles of the precursor, which will hinder further dissolution for a period, and that is called the residual period. And later on, the phases that were initially formed in the secondary stage will grow into stabilized solid products, so the dissolution rate of the precursors will increase again in the resumption stage. And for us, what actually matters in early stages is the forward dissolution rate. And the forward dissolution rate can actually be measured by experiments where you have very high alkaline solutions to glass ratios, and you measure the evolution of the concentration of elements in that solution with time. And then you reach this equation in which you calculate the forward dissolution rate, normalized it by the fraction of the species that you're analyzing, the volume of the solution, and the mass and the specific surface area of the initial glass. And this change, this evolution in concentration is important for you to evaluate if formation of phases is stable or not through thermodynamic calculations by the parameter effective saturation index, which is basically the ratio of the ion activity product, so the actual activities of these species in the solution, divided by the solubility product of one given phase. So ESIs are calculated individually for each phase that could be formed. And a positive value indicates supersaturation of that phase in the solution, so they are favorable to be formed, and negative values indicate undersaturation, so they won't be formed. So we chose to use the approach of synthetic glasses that resemble siliceous fly ash, calcareous fly ash, and two different blast furnace slags, using silicon, aluminum, and calcium as the components. And the main thing about these glasses is that they have variable silicon to calcium ratios from 4 to 0.9. The synthetic glasses are obtained by melting and quenching of a mix of these three oxides. And we did thermodynamic modeling to calculate the potential formation of the main reaction products of alkali-activated materials that have available thermodynamic dating literature. And for that, we use the GIMS software. And here we can see as the fractogram and the spectra of the raw glasses that slag glasses are more disordered than fly ash glasses, but fly ash S2, calcareous fly ash, has a microstructure which is more similar to slag than to fly ash. We see this in both plots. And also in the FTIR spectra, we see that the main shift of the tetrahedral species is shifted to higher frequencies according to increasing silicon to calcium ratios. But we also see this small shoulder at 1023 that might be an indication of the presence of octahedrally coordinated aluminum, which might tell us that there are some in very small levels, some mullite-like portions of our glass. And the experiments that we performed were dissolution experiments in highly diluted systems with sodium hydroxide in 3 different concentrations, a solution glass ratio of 1,000 using 1 gram of glass. And we took samples from 15 minutes to 7 days. And we also performed isothermal calorimetry to correlate both results, both experiments, at fixed temperature, fixed sodium content, and fixed water binder ratios. And so as a result of the dissolution experiments, here we have the 4 glasses. And we observed that apart from silicious fly ash, the other 3 glasses have 3 behaviors. So first a peak in concentration, then a drop, and then a subsequent new increase in concentration of elements. But that's not for all elements. So when we have silicon calcium ratios below 2 for the slag glasses, calcium also increases the concentration. But when we have fly ash glasses, calcium actually stays in a plateau value. So only silicon and aluminum have enhanced increase in concentrations. And in order to understand this drop in concentration after initial stages, we calculated the effective saturation indexes. And we can say that calcium-based products are preferentially formed for all situations, and even Portlandite, which is not so commonly observed in such high pH environments. And calcium and silicon have a preferential formation because we do observe more formation of CSH, or more favorable formation of CSH compared to modified gels like Cash or Knash. And we also see that calcareous fly ash has a transition from slag to fly ash. Why? Because at the initial stages, it has higher saturation indexes values, but after the system releases most of its calcium, it basically behaves as fly ash. So the saturation indexes are lowered and maintained at the same level as silicious fly ash. And the formation of Nash gel is actually only observed for silicious fly ash in later stages. And it's important to notice here that it only happens when your silicon to calcium ratio is above 4. So once your system is depleted in calcium, then formation of Nash is favored. But actually, we didn't expect to see this decrease in concentration. We were expecting to see a continuous increase for a longer time. That means that our forward dissolution stage was actually interrupted by formation of some metastable activated complexes, which ends up decelerating, decreasing the dissolution rates, but gives us 2 different dissolution rates. And that can be confirmed by calorimetry tests. Why? So in the first dissolution stage, we see a very high calorimetry peak for slag glasses, but low for silicious fly ash. So this high initial peak is related to both dissolution and already immediate precipitation of these initial phases. And then we have a secondary peak, which indicates actually formation of stable solid products. This second forward dissolution rate for silicious fly ash happens at very late stages, so in the second day of reaction. And this can be correlated with the formation of Nash. And when we compare silicious with calcareous fly ash, we see that calcareous fly ash has a very small peak after 2 hours of experiments, but later it doesn't show any other types of precipitation of products. So in overall, calcareous fly ash has lower long-term reactivity than silicious fly ash because it doesn't have the formation of products in the secondary stage, as we observed for effective saturation indexes. Now, talking about dissolution rate values, we can see that the dissolution rate of calcium is linearly correlated with initial silicon to calcium ratios in both first and second forward dissolution regimes. However, we see a swap in the trend lines, which might be due to the fact that fly ash S4 doesn't have a pretty defined first peak of concentration, so it's just a continuous increase, and that might lead to misinterpretation of the results. If we remove that data point, we see that the trend is more similar in between the two stages. So we can consider the second dissolution rate as a realistic trend. We also see a linear correlation in between the dissolution rates of silicon and calcium with the silicon to calcium original ratios for both first and second regimes. And again, we see that the trend line could be more accurate if we could have the observation of these initial peaks for fly ash S4. And we see a congruent dissolution behavior in between silicon and aluminum, which has some differences for higher silicon to aluminum ratios in the glass, but at the end it can be negligible and we can consider them as congruent dissolution. And expanding a little bit the concentrations of sodium hydroxide for fly ash S2 and for slag glasses, we can see that calcareous fly ash has a similar trend in all pHs: increase, drop, and new increase. Well, this was not observed for slag glasses that have, they tend to have lower long-term reactivity if you compare the concentrations after 7 days in this situation from a higher concentration of sodium hydroxide. And we can also see that calcium actually remained in a plateau in all of these situations, which means that maybe this pH is so high that it releases completely most of the calcium from the structure of the precursors, leaving behind the calcium pore system. And that is important because we can actually model the formation of the late formation of Nash gel, both in slag and in fly ash, because of the lack of calcium in later stages for the alkali activation of these two types of precursors. As you can see, we have a silicon to calcium ratio larger than 4 that we already indicated that it's favorable for the formation of Nash. Well, and some conclusions is that the dissolution of calcium is linearly correlated to the initial silicon to calcium ratios of the precursor. And also the dissolutions of calcium and silicon are linearly correlated in between each other and to the original silicon to calcium ratio. Calcareous fly ash presented a mixed behavior. First, it acts as slag, and then when the system is depleted in calcium, it starts to behave as fly ash, which leads to an overall lower reactivity. And the products based in calcium, they are preferentially formed for all precursors and all situations. And the formation of Nash gel is naturally favorable for siliceous fly ash. But if we have higher pHs, we can see a delayed formation for calcium, calcareous fly ash, and for slags as well. And most importantly, we observed that a silicon calcium ratio of 2 is a threshold to trigger initial precipitation of these reaction products. Below 2, we have spontaneous formation of reaction products, and above 2, this is not favored. And that's all for today. I'll be more than happy to answer questions for you at the end of the session. Thank you.